Warning. This is not just a horror story, but a dark dive into the depths of human fear and cruelty. Brace yourselves, for what you are about to hear is an intense, disturbing tale, and not for the faint of heart. The story of the Texas Chainsaw Killer is no ordinary tale. It is a warning, a shadow of terror that resonates through the darkest alleys of our psyches, where the rational and the irrational mingle and merge in a deadly dance. Imagine a desolate landscape, where the deafening sound of a chainsaw echoes in the darkness, piercing the silence with a violence that makes your blood run cold. This sound is not just the prelude to a tragedy, it is the warning cry that something abominable is lurking. The one who wields this saw knows no mercy, and his grotesque mask, made from the faces of his victims, is a reminder that horror knows no bounds, that the human mind, when corrupted, can become a merciless machine of destruction. We are not talking about a fairy tale monster or a supernatural creature. What we are about to tell is terror incarnated in the flesh. A man, a human being who became the very reflection of violence and despair. This is the legacy of Leatherface, the Texas Chainsaw Killer, a predator driven by hatred and darkness. As you listen to this story, remember that true danger may lie where you least expect it. The monsters that terrorize the night can emerge from the depths of a society that has failed to care for its own. Prepare yourselves for a story that will bring to the surface your fear of the unknown, of brutality and of lack of control. Hold on tight, because the path we are about to tread is tortuous and there is no turning back. Now let's get to the real story. The story of Ed Gein, the Texas Chainsaw Killer. Ed Gein, also known as the Texas Chainsaw Killer, was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. His life and crimes are shocking and disturbing. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. His childhood was marked by an estranged relationship with his father and a domineering mother. He grew up isolated and developed an obsession with his mother. In 1945, Gein began committing crimes after his mother's death. He began robbing graves and digging up bodies to make masks and costumes from human skin. Gein used brutal methods to kill his victims. He chose elderly, lonely women. He lured these women to his home with promises of help or shopping. He killed them by shooting or strangling them and dismembered the bodies with a chainsaw. Gein chose his victims who resembled his mother. He was looking for women who were elderly women between 50 and 70 years old, lonely and without close family, with physical characteristics similar to his mother. In 1954, Gein was arrested after the disappearance of Bernice Wardens, a woman who looked very similar to his mother. During the search, the police found human remains in his home, clothing made of human skin, masks made of skulls, a chainsaw used to dismember bodies. Ed Gein is considered one of the first serial killers in the United States. His case inspired films such as Psycho and The Silence of the Lambs. Ed Gein's story is a reminder of the brutal crimes that can be committed by disturbed individuals. His legacy continues to fascinate and horrify people to this day. The Texas Chainsaw Killer is one of the most disturbing icons of cinematic horror, known worldwide thanks to the film The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, directed by Tobe Hooper. This work, in addition to its oppressive atmosphere and violent scenes, instigated a long series of discussions and analyses about human nature, the limits of sanity and the terrors of real life. But behind the film, there are also real inspirations and a cultural context that help to understand how this macabre legend became consolidated in the popular imagination. 1. Origins of the character. The character known as Leatherface, the infamous killer with a human skin mask and a chainsaw, was inspired by a real criminal named Ed Gein, one of the most notorious murderers and necrophiliacs in the history of the United States. Gein was not exactly a serial killer, but what was found in his house shocked the world. Clothes and furniture made of human skin and bones, faces used as masks and carefully preserved body parts. He had a habit of digging up corpses in cemeteries and reusing the remains in his macabre art collection. This disturbing figure of Gein directly influenced the character Leatherface, but Tobe Hooper, the director, also had other inspirations when creating the film. At the time, the late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of social tension, marked by the Vietnam War and profound cultural changes in the United States. The violence portrayed in headlines and broadcast on the news influenced Hooper, who wanted to explore the visceral and realistic horror that he observed in the world around him. The use of the chainsaw as a weapon was a choice that added an even more brutal element to the character. The chainsaw is loud, heavy and out of control, an object that, like Leatherface himself, is difficult to control and causes destruction with little effort. The deafening sound of the saw becomes a metaphor for chaos and panic. Fear comes not only from violence but also from the feeling of helplessness, from confronting something that is impossible to rationalize or negotiate. Leatherface is an unstoppable and irrational force, a reflection of the deepest fears of human beings. Leatherface is at the same time victim and monster. He is manipulated by his family of cannibals, raised in an environment of extreme isolation, poverty and moral distortion. It is possible to interpret the film as a critique of rural abandonment, of the remnants of a society where those marginalized by poverty end up being forgotten and become monsters out of necessity, as a form of survival. This social critique appears subtly throughout the film, creating additional tension for the audience, who finds themselves questioning to what extent society is to blame for the monsters it creates. The house as a labyrinth of horror. The house where the family lives is almost a character in itself. It is a claustrophobic setting with cramped rooms, dark hallways and objects made from human remains. This environment reflects the family's psychology. Chaotic, distorted, with no boundaries between the sacred and the profane. The house is a labyrinth of horrors that challenges the sense of security that home usually represents. It becomes a symbol of decay. Leatherface, the chainsaw killer, had a brutal and meticulous method of execution, which left his victims in a state of absolute terror before finally extinguishing their lives. His approach was marked by intensity and raw force, an unbridled violence that reflected the savagery and lack of control of his impulses. Each of his actions was a true ritual of carnage, where blood and fear mixed in the environment in an overwhelming way. With a brutal hunting and intimidation technique, Leatherface never acted silently. The deafening sound of his chainsaw was the first thing his victims heard, a sound that pierced the silence and invaded every corner with a menacing presence. It was almost as if he wanted his victims to know what was coming. When he turned on the saw, the echo of the engine reverberated, spreading panic. That cutting sound left no chance of escape, because any attempt to escape would be fruitless. The victims were already in his web. Before the first strike, he would stalk them, almost like a beast toying with its prey before the final attack. Running with the saw raised, his massive and clumsy body made it clear that he was not a silent and precise hunter, but rather a brute force that crushed everything around him. Leatherface enjoyed feeling the fear exuded by his victims. Their screams and pleas were, for him, a confirmation of his domination. He enjoyed every second, implying that psychological terror was part of his control technique. He fed on the despair and agony that his targets showed when they realized they were in the hands of a monster. That in the first strike, an aggression without mercy. When he finally reached his victims, Leatherface attacked with calculated precision, choosing strategic points such as the legs or the abdomen. A single strike was enough to cut deeply into the flesh and bones, incapacitating them and preventing them from escaping. He cut tendons, destroying any possibility of resistance. The sound of the saw tearing flesh and grinding bone was horrific, and the smell of fresh blood mixed with the saw oil, creating a nauseating atmosphere. Leatherface made no distinction between human and object. To him, his victims were meat to be cut and torn apart. He struck repeatedly as if there were no limit to his violence. Each blow was an affirmation of his brutal strength, and he kept going until he had transformed the body into a shapeless lump of flesh and blood. It was almost as if he were sculpting, using the chainsaw as a tool for macabre art, as final ritual, a violent end and the transformation into a trophy. After death, Leatherface treated his remains with a mixture of coldness and dark ritualism. He would remove the skin from their faces with terrifying precision, creating the masks he would later wear. Each face was carefully skinned and preserved, becoming part of his grotesque wardrobe. By using these faces, he seemed to absorb some of the identity of his victims, almost as if he wanted to wear their skins to complete his monstrous transformation. In some cases, he would also separate parts of the bodies, carefully choosing the bones and tissues that he would use to create furniture and decorative objects for his home. In this way, his victims were never completely discarded. Their bodies became trophies that he would display in his macabre home, as a lasting reminder of his absolute power and human frailty in the face of his brutal strength. A coldness in the conduct of terror. Leatherface showed no emotion or remorse in his actions. His eyes, when visible beneath the mask of skin, were empty, devoid of any empathy or trace of humanity. He operated like a machine, an extension of the very chainsaw that he wielded with such mastery. His executions were impersonal and ruthless, as he acted as a tool without feelings, someone who blindly obeyed the impulses of destruction and the orders of his family without question. He was, in essence, a force of death and destruction without hesitation or mercy. Thus, Leatherface established himself as one of the most terrifying and unscrupulous killers, an embodiment of fear and irrationality. His executions were not just murders, they were rituals of pure violence and terror, transforming the surrounding environment into an extension of his twisted mind.